She was 19 years old, newly widowed, buried in debt she never created, and about to be thrown out of the only home she had ever known. But here is the part that nobody in that town could have predicted. She was not going to beg. She was not going to break. She was going to use something the richest man in the valley had never thought to use: the dirt beneath his feet. And by the time the worst storm in a generation had passed, every powerful man who had condemned her would be crowded inside her tiny, so-called ruin, alive because of her, humbled beyond anything their pride had ever prepared them for. This is the story of our advance. And buried inside it is a principle so simple, so ancient, so thoroughly ignored by modern people that once you understand it, you will never look at the ground beneath you the same way again. The decision was delivered on October 14th, 1876. It came without sentiment. A pronouncement as cold and hard as the granite peaks looming over the town of Providence Flats. Ara stood before the town council, three men whose faces were etched with the unshakable certainty of their own righteousness. Silas Croft, the banker who held the deeds to half the valley, spoke without even looking at her. His voice was a dry rustle of paper and coin. In light of the outstanding debts of your late husband, Jacob Vance, the council finds it necessary to reclaim the property, the cabin, and the associated 160 acres as collateral. He paused, adjusted his spectacles. The debt amounts to $112. The property's assessed value is $150. The town is being generous. Generous. The word hung in the stale air of the town hall like smoke. Ara felt a hollowness spread through her chest, an emptiness colder than the autumn wind rattling the window panes. Jacob had been dead 6 weeks. His life ended by a falling ponderosa pine in the woods. A freak accident. She was a widow. She was essentially an orphan. She was 19 years old. Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was exceeded only by his girth, cleared his throat. It is a sad providence, Ara, a test of your faith. But the laws of man, like the laws of God, must be respected. Order must be maintained. The third council member, Jedediah Stone, the master carpenter who had built nearly every structure in town, said nothing at all. He simply stroked his gray beard and stared at the floorboards. He had been Jacob's friend. He had taught Jacob how to swing an axe. His silence was the cruelest blow of all. They were not throwing her out entirely. That would have been overt cruelty, and these were men who preferred their cruelty veiled in procedure. Croft produced another document. The town and its charity offers you the use of the old trapper's shack down by Whisper Creek. It is on unclaimed land, but we will overlook the squatting for the season. For the season. Those words meant one thing until the spring thaw. If you survive. The old trapper's shack was not a dwelling. It was a landmark for where the valley trail met the creek. A collection of rotting planks, chinking that had long since crumbled away, a roof riddled with holes. No one had lived in it for a decade. It was a place for porcupines in decay. Ara did not plead. She did not weep. The grief for Jacob had scoured her clean of tears. She met Silas Croft's gaze for the first time. Her eyes, a clear, steady gray. "I see," she said. 2 words, small and hard as a stone cast against a wall of indifference. She turned and walked out of the town hall, the door closing behind her with a definitive click. Her life in Providence Flats, the life she had built with Jacob, was over. A new one had just begun. A desperate one. The shack was worse than she remembered. It stood canted to one side as if exhausted. The roof was riddled with holes. The single window was a gaping void, its glass long shattered. Inside, the space was no more than 12 feet by 14 feet. No floor, only packed earth, already damp and cold to the touch. Her worldly possessions were a single cart, a cast-iron stove, a bedroll, a box of kitchen implements, Jacob's tools, and a small leather-bound book filled with her grandmother's spidery script. That first night, she slept fitfully, wrapped in every blanket she owned. The cold seeped up from the ground and into her bones. Frost came before dawn. painting the dead grass silver and turning her breath into white vapor. And in that pale, killing cold, Ara Vance arrived at a conclusion with absolute certainty. She would not survive a winter in this place. Not as it was. The cold would creep in, settle in the dirt floor, and turn the very ground she slept on into a block of ice. It would leach the warmth from her body faster than any fire could replenish it. The men of the council expected her to fail. They expected her to come crawling back to the church, begging for a place as a scullery maid, or to simply pack her things and walk the 40 miles to the next settlement, a journey already becoming treacherous in October. They saw a young bereaved woman, alone and helpless. What they did not see was the granddaughter of Anna Petrova. Anna Petrova had survived 3 winters on the Siberian steppe with nothing but a knife and the knowledge passed down through her bloodline. That knowledge lived in a small leather-bound book. And now, it lived in her granddaughter's memory. On the morning of October 16th, Ara took Jacob's shovel and pickaxe and walked the perimeter of her new pathetic domain. The shack sat on a gentle slope about 50 yards from the bank of Whisper Creek. The creek was not wide, but it was deep and fast-moving, fed by a mountain spring that never froze entirely, not even in the deepest cold. She looked from the creek to the shack, eyes narrowing in thought. Her grandmother's voice came back to her, a low, steady murmur from a childhood spent at her knee. "The earth has 2 hearts," the old woman used to say. "The fiery heart deep below, and the warm heart just beneath the frost. The earth gives warmth if you know how to ask. Here is the thing most people have never been told. The ground beneath your feet, even in the middle of a brutal winter, maintains a relatively stable temperature just a few feet down. Below the frost line, the earth hovers between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in most climates. It does not freeze. It does not roast. It simply holds. This is why root cellars work. This is why ancient peoples built homes partially underground. The earth itself is a thermal battery, storing energy from the summer sun and releasing it slowly through the winter. Modern construction largely ignores this because we have furnaces and insulation and electricity. But strip those things away, and the person who understands the ground is the person who survives. Ara understood the ground, and she was about to use it. Her plan was something her grandmother had called a Teplavoy corridor, a warmth corridor. She would dig a trench, not a foundation trench, but a long, deep channel running from beneath the center of the shack all the way downhill into the gravel bed of Whisper Creek. This trench would act as a subterranean lung. It needed to be deep, well below the frost line, which in these mountains could reach 6 feet. At that depth, the soil held a constant temperature just above freezing, and the creek bed, thermally massive and fed by a spring, was warmer still. The trench would draw that stable, slightly warmer air from the deep earth and creek bed, channeling it into a sealed air gap she would build beneath a new wooden floor. The colder, denser air inside the shack would sink and be pushed out through a second, smaller vent, creating a slow, constant, passive circulation of geothermally tempered air. No fire needed. No fuel consumed. The earth doing what it has always done, quietly, patiently, for free. It was a tremendous amount of work for a team of strong men. Ara was one woman with a shovel and a dwindling supply of dried beans. But she began that very day. Her first task was supplies. She walked back into Providence Flats, head high, ignoring the pitying stares. She went to the general store, not the bank, and she sold the last item of true value she owned. A small gold locket Jacob had given her with a tiny pressed flower inside. She received $7 for it. It felt like selling a piece of her heart. With the money, she bought 20 rough sawn pine planks and 3 lengths of 6-inch diameter terracotta drainage pipe, the kind used for culverts. Total cost, $6.52. She had $1.48 left to her name. She arranged for the materials to be delivered to the edge of town. She could not afford delivery to the shack itself. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, she began to dig. The topsoil was soft, but a foot down she hit dense clay and rock. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a jarring shock up her arms. Each shovelful was a monumental effort. She filled a bucket, carried it outside, dumped it, returned. Over and over and over. Her hands, soft from a life of keeping a home, became a landscape of blisters that burst, bled, and hardened into calluses. Her back screamed every morning. She ate sparingly. Dried beans, a little flour mixed with water and cooked on the small stove. Every muscle ached with a deep structural pain. But with each foot of progress, something harder than pain took root in her chest. She was not succumbing. She was fighting back with the only weapon she had: her body, Jacob's tools, and Anna's wisdom. It was on the third day of digging that she received her visitors. Jedediah Stone and Reverend Miller appeared at the doorway, their shadows falling long across the dirt. Ara was waist deep in the hole, face smudged with earth, hair tied back. "Good heavens, child," Reverend Miller exclaimed, his face arranged in an expression of theatrical concern. "What is the meaning of this? Are you digging an indoor root cellar?" Ara rested one hand on the shovel handle. "I am improving my foundation, Reverend." Jedediah Stone stepped inside, his experienced eyes scanning the hole, the mound of excavated dirt, the planks stacked against the wall. He grunted. "This is no foundation, girl. A foundation needs to be under the walls, not in the middle of the floor. You're digging a sump pit. You'll have this whole shack filled with water come spring. The trench will run downhill to the creek," Ara said, her voice even and calm. "It is for air, not water." Jedediah scoffed with the casual contempt of a man who has never been wrong. "Air? What foolishness. You need a good stove and a cord of seasoned oak, not a hole in the ground to let the cold in." He kicked at a loose clod of dirt. "This is woman's folly. You don't know the first thing about building. Jacob, bless his soul, he would have known better." The mention of Jacob's name was a deliberate cruelty, a reminder of her loss and her supposed helplessness. But Ara did not flinch. "My grandmother taught me some things," she said quietly. "Old wives' tales and superstition," Reverend Miller interjected, shaking his head with a sorrowful certainty. "The Lord provides through honest work and sound principles, Ara, not by burrowing in the earth like a badger. I urge you, cease this strange labor. Come to the church. The congregation will find you a place. Mrs. Croft needs help in her kitchen." It was the offer they had been waiting for her to accept from the beginning. Servitude dressed as charity. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," Ara said, turning back to her work. "But I will see this through." She drove the shovel into the hard-packed clay. The scraping sound filled the silence. The two men exchanged a look of mingled pity and exasperation. They left without another word. The encounter only hardened her resolve to the consistency of iron. For the next 2 weeks, she worked from dawn until dusk. The trench grew, a raw, deep scar extending from the shack's interior down the slope toward the creek. She used a long, straight plank and a spirit level from Jacob's toolbox, meticulously checking the gradient every few feet. The floor of the trench needed a consistent, gentle slope, 1 inch for every 10 feet, to ensure air would flow naturally without assistance. Passive, constant, self-sustaining. When she reached a depth of 8 feet, well below the frost line, she began digging horizontally toward the creek. The soil here was easier, but more prone to collapse. She shored up the sides with some of the planks she had intended for the floor. By mid-November, the trench was complete. It stretched 67 feet, a subterranean passage from the heart of her home to the edge of the water. The final, most dangerous stage was tunneling through the last few feet of the creek bank, working in frigid water until she could lay the last section of terracotta pipe, its opening protected by a small grate of woven wire to keep out rodents and debris. Now she built the conduit. She laid the terracotta pipe in the trench nearest the creek. For the rest of the length, she used a technique from her grandmother's book. She lined the bottom of the trench with flat, overlapping stones gathered from the creek bed. Then she built low, parallel stone walls along the trench's length, creating a channel 8 inches wide and a foot high. She capped it with more flat stones, a rustic but effective subterranean aqueduct for air. She covered the whole thing with coarse gravel to allow permeation while preventing fine soil from clogging the channel. Then she backfilled everything, tamping it down firmly with her feet and the back of her shovel. When she was done, the only visible evidence of weeks of brutal labor was a long, slightly raised mound of earth stretching to the creek and the open end of the conduit inside her cabin. Inside, she built the plenum chamber over the trench opening, a shallow rectangular pit roughly 2 feet deep, lined with planks to create a sealed box. Over this, she laid the wooden floor. She left one small grated opening at one end, directly above the plenum, and a small vent near the wall at the opposite end of the cabin. The slightly warmer air from the subterranean conduit would rise into the plenum, circulate in the sealed space beneath the floorboards, and push the colder, heavier air out through the far vent. Continuous. Passive, requiring nothing from her but the labor of building it once. Her final task was insulation. She spent a week cutting thick bricks of sod from the tough prairie grass, stacking them against the exterior walls until they were banked up to the roofline. She used a mixture of clay and grass to seal the countless gaps between wall planks. She repaired the roof with salvaged tin and tar bought with her last few cents. By the time the first snows fell on December 2nd, the dilapidated trapper's shack had become something else entirely. From the outside, it looked like a humble mound of earth, a part of the landscape itself. Inside, it was tight, still, and secure. The first true test came a week later. A cold snap descended on the valley, plunging temperatures to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In Providence Flats, the townspeople stoked their fires high. Columns of smoke rose straight into the still, frigid air. Inside their conventionally built cabins, floors were icy and drafts snaked in around windows and doors. Inside Ara's shack, the air was cool, but not cold. A small fire in her stove was enough to keep the interior at a comfortable 55 degrees. The miracle was the floor. She knelt and placed her palm flat against the wood. It was cool to the touch, but it was not the life-leeching, bone-deep cold of frozen earth. She could feel a faint, almost imperceptible current of air rising from the grate. It was not warm air, but it was air that was 38 degrees instead of 10 below 0. Her grandmother's theories were not folly. They were physics. The earth was breathing warmth into her home. She saw no one. She chopped firewood from deadfall near the creek, but she needed far less than anyone else. She set snares and caught rabbits. Her small supply of flour and beans lasted longer than she had hoped. She spent her days reading the leather-bound book, mending her clothes, and feeling a quiet, deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with having used her mind to solve a problem that everyone else had declared unsolvable. She had faced the judgment of the town and the fury of nature, and she was prevailing. The town, for its part, did not concern itself. They simply assumed the inevitable. "The poor girl won't last till Christmas," Silas Croft was heard to say at the general store. "It's a tragedy," but she was too proud to accept help. Jedediah Stone agreed. "That shack has no proper foundation. The frost will heave it apart by January." Their pronouncements were delivered with the unshakable confidence of men who had built their authority on never being wrong. The storm began on the evening of January 18th, 1877. It did not arrive with the fury of a normal blizzard. It arrived with a strange, silent intensity. The snow fell not in flakes, but in tiny, hard pellets that hissed against the roof. The sky turned a bruised slate gray, and the temperature began to plummet. By morning, Providence Flats was buried under 2 feet of snow, and it was still falling. The wind built from a low moan into a shrieking gale, sculpting the accumulating snow into massive, impassable drifts. What descended on that valley would later be known in regional records as the Great White Death. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. The temperature dropped to 20 below, then 30 below, then an almost inconceivable 42 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind howled at over 50 miles per hour. Any exposed skin would have been frostbitten in minutes. Providence Flats was completely isolated, a handful of wooden boxes being slowly crushed by the immense power of an Arctic vortex. Inside their homes, the people of the town fought a desperate, losing battle. The log walls, so sturdy in summer, offered little resistance to a frost this profound. The chinking between the logs contracted, opening tiny fissures for the wind to knife through. The single-pane glass windows became coated in inches of opaque ice. But the primary enemy, just as Ara had understood from the very first frost, was the floor. The ground beneath their cabins was frozen solid to a depth of several feet, and that cold radiated upward relentlessly, making the air near the floor dozens of degrees colder than the air near the ceiling. Families huddled together on their beds, wrapped in every blanket they owned, feeding their stoves with frantic desperation. Wood piles meant to last for weeks vanished in days. Soon, people began burning furniture. A chair, a wardrobe, a kitchen table. All sacrificed to the hungry flames in a futile attempt to keep the killing cold at bay. In Silas Croft's large two-story house, the biggest in town, the situation became dire. Despite two massive fireplaces and a large cast iron stove, the downstairs rooms were uninhabitable. The family was confined to a single upstairs bedroom. They had burned through their entire woodshed and were now breaking up the guest room furniture. The fear in that house was a palpable thing, colder even than the air. Croft, the man of finance and order, was helpless. His money, his deeds, his influence, worthless against the implacable physics of cold ground. Reverend Miller prayed constantly, his pleas lost in the howl of the wind. His wife was ill, her breathing shallow in the frigid air of their bedroom. They had run out of firewood and were burning books from his library, the works of theologians turning to ash in a search for a few more minutes of warmth. He prayed for deliverance. The storm only intensified. Jedediah Stone, the master builder, faced the ultimate indictment of his life's work. His own home, which he had always boasted was the tightest and best built in the valley, was failing him. He knew the principles of construction, of tight joinery and solid foundations, but his knowledge was conventional. It had never accounted for a cold this profound, this persistent. His floor was a sheet of ice. The nails in the walls contracted with loud pops. The timbers groaned under the pressure. He looked at his wife and son, their faces blue and pinched, and felt a shame that burned hotter than his dwindling fire. All his pride, all his expertise had come to nothing. He had built coffins. It was on the morning of the fourth day that the desperation in Jedediah Stone's house reached its peak. Their fire was out. The last burnable furniture was gone. The temperature inside the main room was below zero. His son was no longer shivering. A dangerous lethargy had set in, the stillness that precedes hypothermia's final act. It was then that a strange, half-mad thought entered his mind. He thought of the girl, the foolish, stubborn girl in the trapper's shack. He had predicted her demise with such certainty. He had imagined her frozen solid, a monument to her own folly. But what if? The question was a tiny, irrational spark in the cold darkness of his mind. What if she had known something he did not? "I'm going out," he announced. His wife stared at him, eyes wide with terror. "You can't, Jedediah. You will die. We will die in here if I do nothing," he replied. His voice was grim. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and tied a rope to his porch railing. He would play it out as he went. It was his only hope of finding his way back. Stepping outside was like stepping onto another planet. The wind was a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his eyes. The world was a churning maelstrom of white. He could not see more than 5 feet in any direction. He stumbled through drifts over his head, pulling himself along with the rope, his lungs burning with every gasp of super-chilled air. He did not go toward Croft's house. He turned in the opposite direction, toward the creek, toward the girl's shack. The journey of less than half a mile took nearly an hour. He fell a dozen times, losing all sense of direction, relying only on the slight downward slope of the land. He was on the verge of collapse when he bumped into something solid. A wall. He brushed away the snow and felt the rough texture of sod bricks. He had found it. The shack looked less like a building and more like a natural drift, a part of the snow-covered earth itself. There was no smoke rising from the small stovepipe chimney. His heart sank. He had been right. She was dead. Still, some desperate instinct drove him on. He found the door, pushed it inward, stumbled inside, and pulled it closed against the raging storm. The contrast was so profound it was disorienting. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by a deep, enveloping quiet. And there was warmth. Not the baking heat of a roaring fire, a gentle, steady, life-sustaining warmth. The air was still and calm. A single candle flickered on a small table. In its soft light, he saw her. Era Vance was sitting in a chair wrapped in a simple woolen shawl, reading her grandmother's book. A small kettle on the tiny stove let out a faint wisp of steam. She looked up. Her expression was not one of surprise. It was one of calm expectation. As if she had known this moment was coming. Jedediah Stone stared, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He pulled the wool from his face, his beard caked in ice. He looked at the floor, the simple, unadorned pine planks. He looked at the walls, free of frost. He looked at the small pile of firewood next to the stove, barely diminished. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and touched the floor. It was cool, but it was a living cool. Not the dead cold of the grave. How? He rasped. A single word. A croak of disbelief. The earth, she said simply. The earth is keeping us warm. The mind of the master builder, the man who understood structure and stress and materials, reeled. He saw the grated vent near the floor. He remembered her talk of a trench, of air, the foolishness he had mocked. The woman's folly he had dismissed. It was not folly. It was a work of genius. A genius that was keeping her alive and comfortable while he and the rest of the town froze to death in their solid, respectable, ignorant homes. My family, he choked out. My boy, he's freezing. Ara closed her book and stood. Then go and bring them here, she said. Her voice held no triumph, no accusation. It was simply the statement of a fact. This place was safe. It was a sanctuary. Jedediah Stone did not hesitate. He nodded once, a single jerky motion of his head, and turned to plunge back into the storm. But this time he was not driven by desperate hope. He was driven by certainty. He followed his rope back to his house, his mind ablaze with the miracle he had witnessed. He burst into his own frozen home, found his wife huddled over their son, weeping. Get your coats, he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority she had not heard in days. We are leaving. I have found shelter. As he had struggled back through the town, he had hammered on the doors of the Miller and Croft houses, screaming his discovery into the wind. He found Silas Croft and Reverend Miller in a state of near-total collapse, their families on the verge of hypothermia. Humbled by a terror that transcended pride, they too gathered their loved ones and followed Jedediah Stone into the white fury. One by one, the families of the men who had condemned Ara Vance stumbled into her tiny earth-warmed home. The banker, the reverend, the master builder, their wives, their children, faces etched with frostbite and disbelief. They crowded into the small space, a huddled mass of shivering refugees. 17 people survived inside that 12 by 14-foot shack that the council had offered as a cruel joke. They survived because one woman had refused to accept the world's assessment of what was possible. They survived because of the wisdom of an old woman from the Siberian steppe, preserved in a leather-bound book, and carried across an ocean by a granddaughter who had been paying attention. Ara accepted them without a word of reproach. She brewed tea. She shared her rabbit stew. She made space for the children closest to the stove. Her ruin had become an ark. For 2 more days, the storm raged. And inside that tiny haven, wrapped in the warmth of the deep earth, they endured together. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, The sun rose on a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. Providence Flats looked like a graveyard of tiny white hills. From the earthen mound of Ara's shack, 17 people emerged, blinking in the light. The walk back to their homes was a somber pilgrimage. They found their cabins filled with a killing cold that would take days to banish. Worse, they found that not everyone had been as fortunate. 3 families, 8 people in total, including 2 children, had perished in their homes, frozen solid in their beds. They had died in houses built on sound principles, with proper foundations, while the town's most powerful men had survived in a dirt-banked shack with a hole in the floor. The reckoning came 2 days later in the same town hall where Ara had been sentenced. This time the entire surviving population of Providence Flats was present. It was Silas Croft who stood before them, his face pale and drawn. He did not look at his ledgers. He looked directly at Ara Vance, who stood at the back of the room. "I have been a fool," he said, his voice cracking. "We have all been fools. We valued our pride and our traditions over common sense and wisdom. We sent this young woman to what we believed was her death, and in our arrogance, we nearly met that fate ourselves." He took a long breath. "Ara Vance saved my children. She saved my wife. She saved me. The debt of Jacob Vance is hereby canceled. The deed to the land and cabin are returned to her, effective immediately. It is a pitifully small restitution for what she has given us." Then Reverend Miller stood, his face a ruin of shame. "The Bible speaks of the wisdom of the humble and the foolishness of the proud," he said. "I preached those words without understanding them. I offered charity when I should have offered respect. I saw a hole in the ground and called it folly, when in fact it was an act of profound intelligence. I asked for her forgiveness and his." Finally, Jedediah Stone walked to the front of the room and turned to the assembled men. "For 20 years I have built the houses in this valley," he said, "and in the greatest test, they failed. They were tombs. I built with timber and nails. But I forgot the most important material, the earth itself." He turned to Ara, his eyes meeting hers with a raw, unguarded reverence. "I ask you, Mistress Vance, teach me how you did it. Teach us all." And so she did. That spring, as the great melt began and the valley came back to life, Ara's dilapidated shack became a school. The builders and farmers of Providence Flats came not to offer charity but to learn. With Jacob's tools, she showed them the principles of the warmth corridor. She explained thermal mass, the frost line, the constant temperature of deep earth. She drew diagrams in the dirt. She explained the physics of passive air circulation with a clarity that belied her years. They retrofitted their homes, digging trenches, creating plenums beneath their floors, banking their walls with sod. They worked together, a community humbled and reborn from the crucible of the storm. Ara moved back into her home, its foundation now secured by the new old knowledge. She was no longer the outcast, the poor widow. She was the sage of Whisper Creek, the woman who listened to the earth. And here is the moral that this story has been carrying the whole time, the one that matters as much now as it did in 1877. The knowledge that saved 17 lives was not new. It was ancient. It had been passed from grandmother to granddaughter across an ocean, preserved in a handwritten book that the important men of Providence Flats would never have bothered to read. It was dismissed as superstition, as woman's folly, as old wives' tales, right up until the moment it was the only thing standing between 17 people and death. The principle itself, using the stable thermal energy of deep earth to regulate a living space, is real. It is the same principle behind modern earth-sheltered homes, passive geothermal heating, and the Earthship architecture movement. The earth beneath your feet, just 5 or 6 feet down, holds a temperature between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in most of the northern hemisphere, regardless of whether there is a blizzard above or a heat wave. That is free energy, available everywhere to anyone willing to dig. Modern people often mistake complexity for intelligence. The town of Providence Flats made that mistake. They had the right materials, the right tools, the right knowledge of conventional construction. What they lacked was the humility to consider that someone without their credentials might understand something they did not. Pride does not keep you warm. The earth does. Aravance's vindication was not written in ledgers or laws. It was written in the very foundations of a town that had learned at a terrible cost that the deepest wisdom is often buried, waiting only for someone with the courage to dig for it.